So sometimes we get bacterial infections in the stomach, and there is a bacteria that can withstand the acidity of the stomach, and this is called Helicobacter. They're called helico because they're kind of a helix. Pylori. So if you think about the pyloric valve, right? So this is a strain of bacteria that can survive in the stomach and cause gastric ulcers. So it used to be when you had gastric ulcers and you went to the doctor, they looked at your diet. You know, they said, oh, well, you need to stop eating certain things that are, you know, are acidic. Like maybe alcohol is really bad too for the stomach. But they also talked about stress. They said you're too stressed out and that's why you have gastric ulcers. And so the idea that bacteria infection could cause gastric ulcers was really, really controversial. And nobody thought that bacteria could survive in that acidic of an environment. And we're talking like pH 2 sometimes in the stomach. And so the scientists who first proved that it was bacteria that was causing gastric ulcers actually ingested the bacteria, got ulcers, then had to take antibiotics, got rid of the bacteria, and their ulcers cured up. So they actually, the scientists actually subjected themselves to an experiment. And so now, if you have chronic ulcers, you need to ask your doctor about H. pylori, because they have actually even a breath test that you can do in the doctor's office to kind of determine if you have it. The problem is that if you do have it, it's like a month or 2 or maybe even 3 months worth of antibiotics to get rid of them. And so it's not like something you want to have. And then there's some evidence that some people have H. pylori and it doesn't have any effect on them. And they could actually carry it and give it to somebody else who would be prone to getting gastric ulcers. Anyway, so that's the bacterial cause of stomach problems, which is relatively new to science. Okay, so let's look at the small intestine. So the small intestine has chemical digestion. So remember that chemical digestion has to do with enzymes. And so we have lipases, right? We have proteases. This includes an enzyme called trypsin, which is a really common protease. So that breaks down protein. We also have pancreatic amylase. So what do you think that breaks down? We talked about, yeah, sugars, right? Carbohydrates. So pancreatic amylase breaks down carbohydrates into simple sugars. Okay, and then we even have nucleases. So in the small intestine, we have lots of different enzymes that work. Okay. We also have mechanical digestion of lipids. So this is due to a chemical, but it's actually considered mechanical because it's more like a detergent in the breaking down of the lipids. So if you think about washing your dishes, if you have a really greasy dish, you have large fat globules. And you're trying to rinse them off the surface and they're sticking because they're not soluble in water, so they stick to the surface of your pan, right? Then you add a detergent and that breaks down the globules into smaller fat droplets so the water can mechanically rinse it off of the pan. And so this is due to something that's produced by the liver. Does anybody know what turns large fat globules into small fat droplets? What is produced by the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and released into the small intestine? Bile, excellent. Okay, so bile is responsible for emulsification. So that's the same thing that a detergent does to fat, right? Then the enzymes, lipases, break down. They actually bind and break them down. Okay, so bile is really interesting because it has a color to it, and it is actually the reason that our feces is brown. So if you've ever had like tan or even white colored feces, it's because it lacked bile. Okay, so bile can be used, the color of the feces can be used to determine if you're actually producing bile or not. Okay, so that's the mechanical digestion. We also have absorption of nutrients. And most of the nutrients are absorbed here. Okay, so most things can't get across the lining of the stomach. We'll talk about some things that can. Watch a video, I think, in lab. And we don't absorb much across the surface of the large intestine, so it's the small intestine. And it's important to realize that the small intestine is small because of the diameter, not because of the length, right? So it's actually longer than the large intestine, and it has a much higher surface area. So it's longer than large intestine. And it has a very large surface area. Oops, and large intestine. And the reason for this is because there's folds. And there's actually folding upon folding. Okay, so if we look at the small intestine, we have folds, and these folds are called, actually we just call them folds. Okay, and then if you look at this at a higher magnification, it actually looks like this, right? So I'm looking at that a higher, and those are called villi. So if I just drew one villi, on the surface we have cilia, microvilli. So this is one villus, and on the surface this is cilia called microvilli. So this is a special adaptation to endothermy, mammals. If you look at the large or the small intestine of like amphibians or fish, or even like the earthworm, you don't see this extreme surface area. But remember, we have to be really efficient at getting nutrients so that we can regulate our body temperature. Okay. So very high surface area. They say that it could be like the surface area of a tennis court is the surface area of your small intestine because of all this folding. Okay, and we talked about the significance of this in lab, and we did that a little experiment with creating the agar cubes. Okay, so let's look at the absorption of nutrients and what types of nutrients are we absorbing. In your book, this is the diagram, okay, from your book. So this is a villi, right? Then these are the microvilli. And you'll notice that in the villi, there are two different types of structures. So each villi has a capillary bed and a lacteal. And the lacteal is from a completely separate system, which is called the lymphatic system. Okay, so each villi has a capillary system and a lacteal. And the lacteal is the lymphatic system. And this is important because specifically when we talk about absorbing cholesterol and other lipids, we don't want to pass it directly into the circulatory system, we want it diluted first. And so it's actually passed to the lymphatic system. Okay. So let's look at the mechanism of different types of nutrients. Okay. So let's look at water-soluble nutrients. So these nutrients have to be small enough by the time they get to your pancreas that they can be absorbed across the surface. If you're missing an enzyme, the nutrients will not be able to get through and they'll just pass through you, right? Or if you're, if there's something wrong with your digestive system, like your pancreas isn't working, then you could be missing enzymes that would help to break down the nutrients, okay? So we're talking about things like glucose and amino acids, for example, really small substances, okay? These get passed into the capillary system. So passed to capillaries and transported to the liver. Via what is called the hepatic portal system. Okay, so let's look at this word, hepatic. What does that mean? Hepatitis, liver, right? So this is hepatic is liver, and portal means it's going from one organ to another without going back to the heart. So this means that it's being transported directly to the liver without going to the heart, and then passed out to the lungs, and then back to the heart and out to the body, right? So it's from one organ to another organ. Okay. So glucose is taken out. It is stored as glycogen in the liver. Okay. The amino acids are also, or can be used to produce proteins in the blood. So like clotting factors in the blood, right? So this is important for glucose homeostasis, or the regulation of glucose levels in the body, right? You want to you have lots of glucose. So say, for example, you drink a Mountain Dew and eat a Snickers bar, right? That glucose goes straight from your small intestine to your liver and it gets taken out. If it doesn't get taken out, it goes to your brain and it causes you to go into a coma, right? And you can die from too much glucose in your blood. Okay. So those are the water-soluble vitamins, or excuse me, nutrients, including vitamins. We can also look at fat or lipid-soluble. Lipid-soluble. Okay, so lipid-soluble nutrients. So one example of a lipid-soluble nutrient would be cholesterol. Okay. And it's really interesting because when I was growing up, right, if you had high cholesterol levels, they said, don't eat eggs, and they put you on this strict diet. But I don't know if you've heard, they've kind of reversed all of that, and you can, even though I have problems with my cholesterol, supposedly I can eat as many eggs as I want, right? I can eat as much dietary cholesterol as I want, because dietary cholesterol doesn't seem to be the culprit in elevated cholesterol levels in your arteries. Okay, so cholesterol gets packed with proteins, so it gets kind of wrapped in proteins or packaged with proteins. And it has a new name when it gets packaged with proteins. They're called chylomicrons. Okay. And then they get passed to the lacteal. And then they're transported through the lymphatic system. And they re-enter the venous circulatory system, the veins, near the neck. So dropped off at veins near neck. Okay. So if I go and I have a Whopper and a fries and a milkshake, I have lots of fats, right, that I'm absorbing, and they're getting passed into my stomach. I don't want it going into the circulatory system because it would clog it up, right? So it gets passed into your lymphatic system, which goes through lymph nodes up through your body, right? And then sometimes you could get clogs in your lymphatic system too, which cause swelling. But they go up and then they get passed back in, and by that time it is not nearly as concentrated, right? So it's more dilute. They've kind of diluted the fats, and it goes back into the circulation. Okay, so those are the two different types of nutrients and how they're handled by the small intestine. Okay, so let's look at our diagram here. Okay. So you've labeled the esophagus, and you could draw in here structures, but you could draw in here, this would be your diaphragm. Okay. This large structure right here is called the liver, and underneath it is the gallbladder. And this is what actually stores bile. So some people have problems with their gallbladder. You can get gallstones where you have too much cholesterol, and then they can have their gallbladder removed. And then they do have problems with digestion of fats, but it's more that the fats can't get broken down, and so they pass right through them. So they could like get diarrhea and other intestinal problems if they take in too many fats at a given time. So it can kind of make them ill in their digestive tract. Okay. So this right here would be the stomach. It also has folds which allow it to expand. It can also shrink up. So if you eat small meals, your stomach might, on a regular basis, you don't eat large meals, so it might be hard for it to expand. Okay. And then this structure right here is called the pyloric valve. Okay, we could put up here, let's put this one too on here. This is the gastroesophageal valve. Okay. Okay. This structure right here is another gland, and this is like the digestive gland that we saw in the other organisms that we dissected, including like the clam and the crayfish. So this is what is referred to as the pancreas. We're going to talk about the pancreas function in a minute. Okay. These would be the small intestine. This is the large intestine. Notice that it is shorter. It's got an ascending, transverse, descending part. Okay, so this is the large intestine. The last part of the large intestine is called what? Does anybody know? Colon, right? So sometimes that becomes cancerous. You get cancerous polyps in there. So people have colonoscopies to check for cancerous growths in the colon. Okay, this part right here, this first part of the large intestine is called the cecum, and we'll talk about the cecum in a minute. What do you think this finger-like projection coming off of the cecum is called? That's the appendix, yeah. Okay. So this diagram could be on your quiz on Wednesday. Remember, your quiz is just over what we've talked about since the midterm. Okay. So let's go back up and talk about the pancreas as a gland. So pancreas is a digestive gland, and it has two components. So we can have an exocrine function. So remember, exocrine function means that whatever is being secreted is actually passed via a duct, right, to the structure. And so these would be pancreatic enzymes transported via a duct. To the small intestine. Okay, so that's its exocrine function. You can actually buy pancreatic enzymes if you have problems with digestion, and you can mix them in with your food. And hopefully they'll get to the small intestine without being denatured in the stomach. The other part of the pancreas is endocrine in nature, and that means that it produces hormone. So it has an endocrine function. So does anybody know what's the endocrine function of the pancreas? What hormones does the pancreas produce? Anybody know? Regulates glucose homeostasis. What's a hormone? What do you, if you're diabetic, what do you get shots of? Insulin, okay. So this is insulin. So insulin is released when glucose levels are too high. Okay. So this causes glucose to be removed from the blood and stored in the liver. Okay, so that's insulin. It has an antagonistic hormone. Does anybody know what the antagonistic hormone is called? Hormone that's antagonistic to insulin is called glucagon. So this is the antagonistic, the one that works exactly the opposite. So it is released when glucose levels are too low. So like if you haven't eaten all day long, your glucagon will be released. Glycogen will be broken down, and glucose will be released a little bit at a time into your blood to maintain your glucose levels at a state where your nervous system can work, because the nervous system runs on glucose. Okay. So that's the pancreas, and we're going to talk about diabetes in a minute. Oh, right here, diabetes. Okay. So diabetes mellitus. This is the common form of diabetes. There's also another one that's called diabetes insipidus, which is actually a completely different disease, but it has some of the same symptoms. So there's an interesting story behind the name, specifically the mellitus. This means honey. Okay. And so the reason behind mellitus is that physicians in the past would diagnose their patients with diabetes mellitus by tasting the urine of their patients. And the urine was sweet. So we have sweet tasting urine. Obviously, we have little glucose sticks that we now put into the urine, right, to test for glucose levels, right? Okay. So there are different types of diabetes. The first type is what is called juvenile type diabetes. And this is type 1. And the reason why it's called juvenile is it tends to happen in children rather than older adults. And it is actually an autoimmune disease. And so what happens is, for some reason, the immune system attacks and destroys the pancreas. Right? So pancreas, the endocrine function of the pancreas is destroyed. Right? So that's type 1. This is relatively rare. And the misnomer is it's juvenile because I could be like a 50-year-old person and I could actually get a viral infection that would destroy my pancreas. And so I would actually have type 1. So the type 1 is also referred to as insulin dependent. And so this means that they have to take insulin. Dependent. That's the only treatment, right? So these are the people that have maybe even an insulin pump that gives them a little bit of insulin at a time, right, to help to regulate. And they also have to be very careful with their diet, okay? The other type of insulin, or excuse me, diabetes, is what is called late onset diabetes. And this is type 2. Okay. This seems to be related to weight, obesity, and diet. There also seems to be a genetic component. So I'll just put maybe a genetic component. So it is believed that some Native American tribes actually are more likely to develop late onset diabetes than other populations. So in Arizona, the Pima Indians have like 50% of the population has type 2 diabetes, right? And they think that there's a genetic predisposition for them to have that type of diabetes. And then with their lifestyle, it just aggravates the type 2. Okay. So this is said to be insulin independent. And the reason why it's called insulin independent is it doesn't have to do with low insulin levels, but it is actually due to cells becoming resistant. So cells become resistant to insulin. So they're just not responding. And so you can give them insulin. If it gets really bad, if their glucose levels are sky high, you have to give them insulin. But you have to give them a lot, so their cells might respond. And then obviously you have to change the diet, have a strict diet, and weight loss is also related to late onset diabetes. Okay, it's kind of a treatment for it. Okay, there's another type of diabetes, which is called gestational diabetes. And this obviously only occurs in people that are pregnant. So pregnant females. And it's kind of interesting because it is actually due to kind of an argument between the mother's body and the fetus's body. And so we could say this is actually intrauterine, so inside the uterus, I like this word, intrauterine parent-offspring conflict. Okay. So if you've ever had kids, you know that they love sugar, right? And they just I don't know, it's something about it. They just love sugar. And the same thing goes with the fetus, right? And so the fetus produces, just normally, the fetus produces a hormone called HPL. And this is called human placental lactogen. Okay, so it produces just normally HPL. And this binds maternal insulin. So what that means is that the mother's insulin doesn't work, right? So the mother has to produce more insulin. And she has to be able to produce more insulin. And if she can't, that's when the gestational diabetes happens, okay? So mother must produce more insulin, okay? If not, you get gestational diabetes. Right. So does anybody know how they test for gestational diabetes? Nobody's ever had a friend or had a baby? That glucose test. And this is just a horrible thing because I had to do it twice because I have 2 children. So you're pregnant and they tell you can't eat anything for 12 hours. And then you go in and they give you this super thick, sugary drink. And so you're on an empty stomach and you're fasting and you have to drink this stuff. And then they take your blood every 20 minutes for like 4 hours, right? And so what they're looking to see is if they give you a shot of glucose, does your glucose stay high and never come back down? Or does it peak and then your insulin comes back and it comes back down, right? So if it stays high, then you have gestational diabetes. And so the treatment for that generally is just diet, right? So you can't eat any carbohydrates. Like I had gestational diabetes, and if I ate a piece of bread and then tested my blood sugar, it was sky high, like just even like whole wheat bread, right? So you just have to eat a lot of vegetables and protein and skip out on most of the sugars and the carbohydrates, okay? The cool thing about, or not the cool thing, but the good thing about this is it's like immediately gone as soon as you give birth, right? So like I couldn't eat a piece of bread without being sick. And then after I gave birth, they brought me like half of a chocolate cake, like a huge piece of chocolate cake. And I ate they wanted me to eat the whole thing. So I ate the whole thing, right? It tasted too sugary after that, but I ate the whole thing. And then they tested my blood sugars and my blood sugar levels were perfectly fine. And so it's the fetus producing this that causes the gestational diabetes, right? But are more prone to having gestational diabetes or to having type 2 diabetes because I had gestational diabetes. So I'm more at a higher risk, okay, for having it. Yeah. It's pretty early. I think it's the first. Yeah. Yeah. So the problem with going through and having gestational diabetes is that the baby then when it's born doesn't have the ability to regulate its glucose levels, and it's been exposed to too high of glucose levels, and the babies tend to get big. So like if you have an 11-12 pound baby, it's likely that the mother had gestational diabetes and that's why the baby got so big. Yeah. Question? Oh, just stretching. Okay. Okay. So we're going to take a break in a minute. Okay. So let's just talk about the liver and then we'll take a break. So the liver, we've already talked about, produces bile. Right? It stores glucose as glycogen. Right? It also produces clotting proteins. So it produces blood clotting proteins. Okay. And the other thing that's amazing about the liver, one thing that it does, is it removes toxins. From the blood. So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Idaho, I worked temporarily, just for a short period of time, in the veterinary program. And so an animal would die, right? And they would send in the liver, right? And it was just amazing. The livers would come in, and some of them would look really nice, but some of them would like be discolored, and they would like have growths on them and all kinds of things. And we were testing the liver for presence of a toxin that could have potentially killed the animal. So if an animal like drops dead in the field, they take the liver out and they send it to a toxicology lab to see if they can figure out what the animal might have ingested to cause it to die. Okay. Also, sometimes there's parasites also. So sometimes we would get livers that had holes in them that looked like they'd had parasitic infections. So one toxin is alcohol. So it metabolizes, we'll say it breaks down alcohol. And one problem with this is that sometimes it cannot break down the alcohol fast enough, and it produces a fat, and then you get what is called fatty liver disease, okay? So if extreme, the alcohol is converted to fat. Okay. And this can lead to fatty liver disease. Now, sometimes people can get fatty liver disease without being alcoholic. Right? So the liver lobes just fill with fat, and then the liver cells and the lobes start to burst, and then the liver turns into connective tissue. So eventually, if this is not treated, the liver turns into connective tissue. And what is that called? Does anybody know? When your liver is just connective tissue, that's called what of the liver? No. This is called cirrhosis. There's two R's there. Cirrhosis of the liver.
Is that when you get jaundice?
Yes. So your liver shuts down, right? And then you're not producing bile. So that's, yeah. So that's the whole, yep. And it's also important to realize that toxins could also be medicine, right? So sometimes our liver has to break down some of the medicines we take in. So like they always say, never take acetaminophen and alcohol together or whatever. If you take too much acetaminophen or like Tylenol, it can actually damage your liver because the Tylenol has to be broken, the acetaminophen has to be broken down by the liver. So like mixing Tylenol and alcohol is a really bad idea for your liver. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and finish up the digestive system. So let's see. I have a assignment for you. So you weren't here on Wednesday. Okay. So this is the assignment we did in class, and you can do it outside of class. And so it's worth 10 points. So people already turned this in. You'll just have to do it on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, it looks like everybody's back, so we'll start. Okay, so remember the large intestine is actually a larger diameter, but it's shorter than the small intestine. And the large intestine has a couple of functions. One is that it houses symbiotic bacteria. And there's actually a part of the large intestine which is really important in this function, and that is called the cecum. So the cecum, not to be confused with coelom, remember the coelom is the body cavity, the cecum is actually a little pocket of the large intestine that helps to prevent the bacteria from being lost when the organism defecates the feces, right? So removes the feces. So it kind of helps. And cecums are different sized depending upon the organism. So if we look at a horse has a huge cecum. And then if you looked at a coyote would have a much smaller cecum, okay? So when we look at herbivores, so like a horse, for example, they are not actually ruminants. They actually have a cecum. The horse has bacteria that break down cellulose. Right, so this is plant material. Okay, we have symbiotic bacteria. So in humans, we have a smaller cecum, but our one of the functions of our symbiotic bacteria is the production of vitamin K. So there is a strand of E. coli that occurs in our normally in our large intestine. So there's different strains of E. coli. Some make you sick, some don't, right? So it's just normally occurring bacteria. These in humans produce vitamin K. And vitamin K is necessary for blood clotting. So when babies are born, their digestive tract does not have any bacteria in it. So they have like a sterile digestive tract. And it's actually filled with this really weird stuff called meconium, which is this real thick, viscous, dark black looking stuff. They haven't been using their digestive system. They've been getting their nutrients directly from the placenta, right? So at birth, babies will start to get and bacteria, and it starts to colonize their digestive tract. And so when babies are born, humans in hospitals, for example, they give them a shot of vitamin K because they lack E. coli. Okay, so they give them a shot just in case they have to do some kind of surgery on the baby. Then their blood will be able to clot, right? So baby expect the shots, right? Baby, when they're born, gets a shot of vitamin K. It's just because they lack the E. coli that produces the vitamin K until they get that colonized. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more. Okay, a little bit. So this is one function of the large intestine. The other function of the large intestine is the reabsorption of water. And the formation of feces. If the large intestine cannot reabsorb water, then you have diarrhea. And diarrheal diseases can cause dehydration really fast, and people can die from severe cases of diarrhea really quickly if they cannot get fluids like intravenous fluids, right? So this can lead to, the lack of this can lead to diarrheal disease, can cause dehydration and death quickly. So one example of a diarrheal disease that is in our world currently is called, oh gosh, now I just lost it, cholera, right? So whenever there's like a catastrophe, like an earthquake or a typhoon or a hurricane, and it goes through a country like in Latin or in South America, there's always a worry that they'll have a cholera epidemic. So cholera is waterborne bacteria. And these cause diarrhea by causing the large intestine cells just lose water. And so with a really bad case of cholera, you're just constantly losing water out through your digestive tract. Okay, so that's an example of a cause for a diarrheal disease, a bacterial cause.
Isn't cholera like what they really look out for when they have natural disasters?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so they're worried that when they have a natural disaster, that the water will be contaminated with human feces, and that's when you get cholera outbreaks. Yeah. Okay, so this is the diagram in your textbook that shows the large intestine with the appendix. And so we can look at the appendix. For the longest time, they didn't know what the appendix did, and it was actually kind of taken out routinely by doctors when they were just like doing other things in there. They'd say, oh, we might as well just take the appendix out. But the appendix, you'll notice, is near the cecum. So that's where we have good bacteria, but the appendix has an immune function. So it fights off bad bacteria. Now, unfortunately, it itself can be infected, right? And then the appendix can get huge, and then it's really bad if it ruptures, because this is just in your body cavity. And so if this ruptures, then think about all the stuff from your digestive tract getting into your body cavity, and it just causes this huge infection in your body cavity. So then they have to go in and they have to flush the body cavity out repeatedly, and then they have to give you massive doses of antibiotics after they remove the appendix, right? So the rupturing of the appendix is a really bad thing to happen. Oftentimes you'll get appendicitis attack and hopefully catch it before it ruptures. We already talked about the cecum. Okay, so this is just a diagram from your book again that shows the cecum of a herbivore being much larger than our cecum. And rabbits actually have a really interesting mechanism for maintaining their good bacteria. Does anybody know how, has anybody raised rabbits and know what you have to allow them to do? So in order to maintain their good bacteria, they actually will eat their own feces. And so they produce two different types of feces, one that is digestive waste, and then one that supposedly is just a pellet of bacteria. And so I don't know how this works, but they somehow know what they're defecating. And so they'll turn around and they'll eat the bacteria as it comes out. And they won't eat the digestive waste. And so that's how it's kind of like probiotics for rabbits, right? So they were like way into probiotics before we even knew anything about it, right? Eating bacteria help to maintain the bacteria in their digestive tract. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that ruminant digestion. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna talk about something else here. Okay. So I want to talk about the microbiome. And this is actually something that Sasha will probably also talk about. So these are all the microbes that your body has. Wow, it's really windy. Okay. And there's been a lot of recent research looking at how the microbiome might be related to different diseases. So it's interesting to find out is if certain bacteria and microbiomes are linked to different types of illnesses. So we can say that it may have a correlation with human disease. So they're looking at, for example, obesity. And so there's some evidence that people who are obese have different bacteria in their digestive tract than people who are not. And so it could be that maybe they're not even eating as many calories as a person that is skinnier, but it has to do with the bacteria and how the bacteria are interacting with the digestive tract that is determining that they're overweight. And so there's kind of been an interest in looking to see if there's a link, and then perhaps we could give people who are obese, we could transplant a good colony of microbes into their digestive tract, and perhaps that could help treat the disease. Okay, so obesity is one, and diabetes that is related to that. Right? The other one that's kind of interesting is depression. So there's some evidence that the microbiome in your digestive tract might make you more prone to depression. And that is because the digestive system produces a lot of neurotransmitters, and specifically serotonin. So we'll put the digestive system. We'll talk about serotonin when we get to the nervous system, but produces neurotransmitters, including serotonin. And actually 90% of your serotonin in your body is in your gut. And so this is what is referred to as the gut microbiome. Right? And sometimes the gut is called the second brain. So we have a nervous system associated with our digestive tracts, right? And so if you have digestive issues, it can affect your mental health, right? So there's a link between digestive illness, maybe things like celiac or Crohn's disease, and depression. Okay. So I'm just going to show you this short little video that talks about microbiomes from the standpoint of human health and disease. It's only like 5 minutes in length.
The next time you look in the mirror, think about this. In many ways, you're more microbe than human. There are 10 times more cells from microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, than human cells in and on our bodies. And our genes are outnumbered 100 to 1 by microbial genes. Scientists even have a name for all these microbial genes, the human microbiome. Now, this might make a lot of people rush for the hand sanitizer. But it turns out most of these microorganisms aren't bad, germs that will make us sick. Most are good. And without these good microbes, our bodies don't seem to do as well. We don't seem to be as healthy, and we actually might get sick more often. So one question is, where do our microbiomes come from in the first place? Well, like a lot of things, it starts with our mothers. As the infant passes through the birth canal, it gets coated with microbes from the mom. These microbes may kind of seed the baby with just the right mix. Combined with bacteria in breast milk and other microbes we encounter early on, they seem to slowly take shape in our first few years of life. The overall mix of our microbes becomes very personal, sort of like a fingerprint or maybe a blood type. But our microbes tend to resemble those of our parents and siblings and may stay with us for much of our lives. They may also be doing all sorts of things, such as educating our immune cells, like this one, teaching them the difference between things they should fight off, bad bugs that might make us sick, and things that aren't a threat, like our good microbes. When we're adults, microbes become our first line of defense, fighting off germs that try to invade our bodies, protecting their turf while protecting our health. Scientists have discovered that they can even spew out their own antibiotics. The types of microbes in your body vary depending on exactly where they live, like different ecosystems in nature. There are wet places like our mouths, noses, and armpits, oily places like our scalps and backs, and dry places like our forearms. Different species of microbes have adapted to each of these habitats. The biggest, most important microbial habitat seems to be in the gut. It's the most complex, the most diverse, and everything microbes are doing everywhere else in our bodies, fighting off infections, revving up and dampening down our immune systems, signaling cells, that's all happening in the gut in spades. They even seem to help regulate our metabolisms, how much energy we burn, and how much fat we store. So if it's not functioning properly for some reason, because of what we eat, the antibiotics we take, that may actually lead to all kinds of diseases. Diseases like colon cancer, colitis, maybe even diabetes and obesity. Some scientists think one reason a lot of diseases are increasing is because we've lost key gut microbes. Our microbiomes look far less diverse compared to those of people in less developed countries and earlier generations. And remember how we get our microbiomes in the first place? From our mothers when we were born and from breast milk? Well, some scientists think that too many babies aren't getting that because of all the C-section and not enough breastfeeding, plus all the antibiotics kids get these days and their obsession with cleanliness. All this may help explain why problems like asthma and allergies have been soaring. Maybe because our microbiomes never taught our immune systems how to work the right way. Maybe swallowing good microbes, probiotics, could prevent and treat some diseases. So could taking prebiotics, essentially food that good microbes love. We end our story with a reminder. This research is really new. We still have a lot to learn about what many of our microbes are really doing. But scientists say that it's getting clearer and clearer that the tiny organisms all over our bodies are essential to our health and happiness.
Are there any questions about that idea? So probiotics would be bacteria that you ingest. Right? So now when you go to the grocery store, yogurt, live cultures of bacteria. You can also buy kefir, which is fermented milk. And then kombucha, right, has bacteria as well as a fungus kind of interaction there. And so there's lots of dietary supplements now that kind of aid you in getting the right kind of microbiome to keep you healthy. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, so we are going to move on to respiration. Start respiration today. And so when we talk about respiration, we can talk about the parts of the respiratory tract where we're actually bringing in air. And so we have the nasal cavity, okay? And it actually functions in a variety of ways, right? It filters stuff from the air. We'll just put filters debris from the air. Right? So we should breathe through our nose whenever we can instead of being a mouth breather. Right? So it's kind of funny because whenever I'm in like dirty places, I'll try not to breathe through my nose. I'm like, that's exactly what my nose is designed for, right? So if you're in a dusty place and you're breathing through your mouth, that's a really bad thing because then you're going to get dust into your lungs, okay? It also helps to humidify the air, right? So we lose water across the respiratory surface. So helps to reduce. So it reduces water loss. When we breathe out, our air that we're breathing out has lots of water in it, right? And so when we're in a dry place, we tend to get dehydrated more than when we're in a humid environment, okay? So it humidify air, that's its function, okay? And then obviously we have sensation of smell. So this, as I mentioned before, smell combines with taste, and a lot of what we taste is actually smell. So like when we taste things complex, like cheese, for example, we're not just tasting salty, we're tasting something else, right? Or umami, right? The interesting thing, though, about the smell is that it is one of the most difficult sensations to describe. So if you think about describing a smell, like what does this room smell like, right? You know, I can't even I smell electricity because of that thing up there. So it kind of smells like electricity, but that doesn't make sense. How does it smell like electricity? You know, and you're like, how do things smell, right? So it's really hard for us to consciously think about smell, but smell might actually be really important because we might be interacting with it subconsciously, right? So we might be smelling people and not even realizing that we're having either a positive or a negative interaction with them based upon their smell, okay? So smell is very strange, and we'll do a little smell lab in a couple of weeks. Okay, so we have the nasal cavity. Then remember that we have the pharynx, right? So this is because the reason why our respiratory system and our digestive system are linked is all because we are chordates, okay? Earthworms, they breathe across the surface of their skin. When you think about honeybees, they breathe, they have holes in their abdomen. Their mouth and their respiratory system are completely separate. But we have a common opening, right? Our pharynx used to be used by primitive chordates to breathe as well as to filter food. Okay, so we have that kind of problem with our system in that we can sometimes get food down the wrong pipe. Okay, so we have the trachea. And at the very beginning of the trachea, we have a structure called the larynx. And this is where our voice box is. So that's an enlargement. And in males, their larynx is bigger, and that's what they call the Adam's apple, right? And the being bigger means that their voices are lower than having a smaller larynx, as is typical of females, not having the big Adam's apple. Okay. The trachea is actually really important in filtering the air. So it is composed of pseudo-stratified, ciliated epithelium. So that's the lining. Remember, the lining is epithelial tissue. The ciliated part here is really important because the cilia produces mucus, the cells produce mucus, and this captures debris. And the cilia moves the mucus and debris back up towards the mouth. okay? So you are constantly having mucus come up into your mouth from your trachea, okay? So that is normal. People who smoke lose the cilia. So like when we have smokers cough, okay? The cilia have been temporarily, they can grow back, but the cilia are destroyed and the mucus accumulates. So what people who are coughers tend to do is they wake up in the morning and they cough and they cough and they cough and they cough up all the mucus that they've been holding in there all night long, right? And that's why coughing is a defense mechanism. It's important to cough if you have mucus in your lungs. So that's why they always say on cough medicine, do not use for an extended period of time, right? If you use it for an extended period of time, like to treat smoker's cough, like if I take cough medicine to treat my smoker's cough, what's going to happen is I'm going to get mucus in my lungs, then I'm going to get pneumonia, right? And then I'm going to get an infection in my lungs, and then I'm going to be dead, right? So this is just a problem. When you don't have the cilia, we know what happens. This is, you have to cough up the mucus physically, okay? So typically, where mucus is coming up and we're swallowing it and we're not even aware of it, of constantly swallowing it, okay? So the trachea then branches into bronchi that go to each lung. So these serve each lung. And then the bronchi, that's, I don't know why I have that thing over my C. So that's plural. One would be bronchus. So you have the left and you have the right bronchus, right? The bronchi then break into smaller and smaller branches. And so it goes from the trachea, this would be my trachea, and then I have my bronchi, right? And then I go into smaller and smaller vessels, right? So it's like a tree, the pulmonary tree, okay? So these ones at the very end connect to these grape-like structures, and that is called the alveoli, right? So this would be my trachea. The ones that branch into the alveoli are called bronchioles. So they're really small windpipes, bronchioles. Okay, so this is called the bronchiole, and then this is my alveoli. The only place where gas exchange takes place with the circulatory system is at the alveoli. So this is where we have the respiratory membrane. Right? So we have gas exchange occurs here. And we're exchanging it with the circulatory system. All of the other parts of our respiratory system is just to convey the air into these alveoli. Okay. So we'll talk about the characteristics of the alveoli, being thin and moist and having a large surface area for gas exchange to take place. Okay. But remember that this is an adaptation to a terrestrial life. So we do not have our respiratory surface like close to the outside. The reason why it's buried is to prevent water loss, right? If we breathe through our skin would have to be moist and we'd be constantly losing water, and there's no way we could keep up with it, right? So that's why our lungs are built like this, is because it helps to prevent water loss from the surface of the respiratory membrane. Okay, so I'll stop there for today. And remember that you have a quiz on Wednesday. And I don't think there's any homework assignments due. I'll be talking about the writing your lab report up, and the next wiki assignment. I'll be talking about that soon.